Imagine waking up not in a soft, modern bed, but on a pile of straw covered with a rough wool blanket. The sound of roosters crowing outside and the distant clatter of wooden buckets at the village well. You're not an adult with worries of taxes and trade, but a child in a medieval village, your world shaped by family, farm chores, local festivals, and the constant rhythm of the seasons. Childhood then was both fleeting and demanding, a time filled with learning survival skills, helping your household, and finding moments of joy in games and stories told by the fire. In this episode, we're going to step back in time and explore exactly what life was like for children growing up in a medieval village. We'll wander through their daily routines, their work and play, the food they ate, the clothes they wore, and the lessons they learned both inside and outside the home. Along the way, we'll uncover how childhood was viewed in a world where life was often short, but traditions and community made every day meaningful. Before we begin, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy relaxing journeys into history. This channel, History for Sleep, is made especially for those who love learning, but also want to wind down, drift off, and find a calm rhythm to fall asleep to. Subscribing helps us grow, and it makes sure you won't miss any of our future stories. And while you're here, let me know in the comments what parts of history fascinate you most and when you usually listen in. Do you turn these on while lying in bed at night? During a nap? Or maybe just as a quiet escape during the day? Your thoughts not only inspire me, but they help shape the stories I create for you. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the sounds of history guide you toward rest. Together, we'll explore what it meant to be a child in a medieval village, from first steps to early responsibilities, and discover how their world connects strangely and beautifully to our own. To imagine the life of a child in a medieval village, we must first step into the fragile and uncertain beginnings of life in that world. Birth was not a moment taken for granted, but one that carried both joy and dread. For families, the arrival of a child was both a blessing and a gamble, for survival was never guaranteed. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, and every new life entered the world against a backdrop of hope, prayer, and worry. When a medieval woman went into labor, the scene was far removed from the sterile setting of a modern hospital. Instead, it unfolded in the dim interior of a timber-framed cottage, often one room shared by the whole family. The air was warm with the smell of the hearth, and other women from the village would gather to help. Midwives, experienced in guiding births, oversaw the process. These women were repositories of practical knowledge: how to encourage contractions, how to cut and tie the cord, and how to comfort the mother through hours, sometimes days of painful labor. But their skills were limited, and without the aid of advanced medicine, complications could quickly turn deadly. Mothers knew this, and so did fathers and siblings waiting outside. Death in childbirth was one of the ever-present shadows of medieval life, and its possibility made every successful birth a moment of deep gratitude. Once the child was born, there was immediate urgency to protect its soul as much as its body. Baptism followed swiftly, often within a few days or even within hours, because the belief was strong that an unbaptized infant's soul might not enter heaven if it died. The parish priest would pour holy water over the tiny head, murmur prayers in Latin, and mark the child as part of the Christian community. In this way, the child was bound not only to its family, but also to the larger body of the village, knit together through the church. Survival beyond the first year was not assured. Many children never lived to see their second birthday, succumbing to fevers, infections, or malnutrition. Families developed a certain resilience to these losses, though grief was always present. A child who survived its fragile early years was considered to have crossed an invisible threshold of hope. For mothers, the care of infants was constant. Breastfeeding was the norm, and it might continue for 2 or 3 years, both to nourish the child and to naturally space out pregnancies. When a mother could not nurse, perhaps due to illness or the death of the mother in childbirth. Wet nurses, often other women in the village, were called upon to sustain the baby's life. Feeding was not measured in ounces or bottles, but in instinct, experience, and the availability of nourishment. Clothing for infants was simple and practical. Babies were often swaddled, wrapped tightly in strips of cloth to keep them warm and to encourage what was believed to be proper growth of their limbs. Swaddling might last for months, though gradually loosened as the baby grew stronger. The sound of a baby crying in its wrappings was common in village cottages, mingling with the noises of animals, the crackle of the hearth, and the murmur of family conversation. As the infant grew into a toddler, the village home was both cradle and playground. Floors were often dirt, covered with straw, reeds, or rushes to soften the ground and absorb waste. A baby crawling on such a floor would find small objects to grasp: a chicken feather, a smooth pebble, a bit of wood. The home was never childproof, and dangers lurked everywhere: open fires, sharp tools, heavy pots. Yet survival meant learning quickly, and older siblings often helped watch over the youngest. The presence of many siblings was typical, for large families were common. Not all would survive to adulthood, but each child added labor to the household as needs, and offered companionship in a world with little privacy. Older sisters might carry the baby on their hip while helping with chores, while brothers entertained toddlers with small games. From the very beginning, children were woven into the fabric of family duty. Religious practices continued to shape early childhood. Mothers and fathers whispered prayers over cradles, asking saints for protection. Amulets and charms were sometimes tied to swaddling bands and iron key, a sprig of herbs, or a carved cross to ward off evil spirits. Stories of fairies or witches stealing infants haunted the imagination, so parents were vigilant, keeping watch during the most vulnerable times. For entertainment, there were no manufactured toys, but babies delighted in what was at hand. A carved wooden rattle, a doll made of scraps of cloth, or the clucking of chickens outside the doorway, all could draw a child's fascination. Laughter and play were not absent, even in hard times, and the simple joys of sound and movement marked the earliest stages of growth. By the time a child was 2 or 3, the expectations of the household began to press more firmly. Walking and speaking were milestones not merely celebrated but necessary, for as soon as a child could move about and understand instruction, they could contribute in small ways. Even toddlers might be asked to carry a bundle of kindling, help shoo chickens from the garden, or fetch a wooden spoon. These were lessons not in play but in survival, and each task, however small, reinforced the idea that every member of the family had a role to fill. Though medieval childhood was filled with risk, it was also filled with resilience. Each day lived was a victory. Each skill learned a step toward joining the rhythm of village life. Birth and early childhood in a medieval village were not periods of sheltered innocence as we often imagine childhood today. Instead, they were times of swift adaptation, where fragility met strength, and where even the youngest learned, in their own way, to navigate a world that was both harsh and wondrous. And so, with the cries of infants mingling with the clang of blacksmiths and the chatter of villagers in the marketplace, life began anew again and again. Each child was a continuation of the family's story, and the village's story, living proof that against hunger, disease, and hardship, people endured and carried their hopes forward into the future. After the uncertainty of infancy, the toddler years in a medieval village were filled with both wonder and expectation. Childhood was not seen as a long, carefree stage of life, but rather as a brief passage into the responsibilities of adulthood. From the moment a child could stand, walk, and form words, the world around them opened into both play and duty. The first steps of a child in a medieval home were moments of celebration, but also signals that the child could now begin to contribute, however modestly, to the household's daily life. Imagine a one-room cottage, dimly lit by the hearth, where a toddler teeters forward, barefoot on a packed earth floor scattered with rushes. A mother or elder sibling stretches out a hand, encouraging the unsteady child to cross the space. The first steps are shaky, accompanied by laughter and clapping. Yet quickly, the triumph turns into the practical. Now that the child can walk, they can follow their mother to the well, carry small bundles, or keep closer to the flock of geese in the yard. Learning the basics in a medieval household meant absorbing the skills of survival through watching and imitating. There was little distinction between teaching and doing. A toddler might sit beside their mother as she spun wool, mimicking the turning motion with chubby fingers, or trail after their father in the fields, dragging a stick through the soil as though plowing. By imitation, they absorbed not only movements, but also the rhythms of work. Speech came in fragments of the local tongue, often dialects thick with regional variations. Children were surrounded by constant talk commands, prayers, songs, and gossip shared by the fire. Their earliest words were shaped not by books, but by the everyday language of the village. Mothers taught children the names of animals, plants, and tools. Fathers might instruct sons in the words for plow, ox, and sickle. Through such small lessons, toddlers began to understand their place in the cycle of work and seasons. Toys, as we think of them today, were almost always improvised. A toddler might clutch a doll made from scraps of cloth, its face stitched with simple eyes and mouth. A carved wooden horse or a smooth pebble became an object of fascination. Children turned the world into their playthings. A stick could be a sword, a pile of mud a castle, a discarded pot shard a drum. Though simple, these objects nurtured imagination, and older children often crafted toys for their younger siblings. Play and learning intertwined. Games like rolling a hoop, tossing stones, or chasing chickens through the yard helped toddlers develop coordination. Rhymes and clapping games, often taught by older siblings, introduced rhythm and memory. The line between play and preparation for adult life was thin, for every game seemed to echo the world of work. A child pretending to herd geese was not only amusing themselves, but also rehearsing for real responsibilities they would soon carry. The home environment was both nurturing and dangerous. Fires burned openly in the hearth, blades lay within reach, and livestock wandered in and out. Toddlers often learned by mishap. A singed finger from the fire, a tumble on uneven ground, a startle from a goose's peck. Parents did not have the luxury of constant supervision, for they were consumed by work. Older siblings or neighbors often kept watch, but children quickly learned caution through experience. Survival demanded awareness, and those who adapted quickly stood the best chance of thriving. Meals for toddlers were simple and often shared directly from the family's pot. Bread softened in broth, spoonfuls of pottage made from peas or beans, or bits of cheese were common first foods. Meat was rare, but when available, small scraps might be given to children to chew. Feeding was communal, and toddlers sat on the floor or a low stool, waiting their turn as bowls were passed around. Hunger was a lesson learned early, for food scarcity was part of village life, and children were taught not to waste even crumbs. Learning the basics also included the early introduction of discipline. Parents expected obedience, and children who could walk and talk were old enough to be corrected. A stern word, a swat, or a pull of the ear reinforced rules. Respect for elders, silence in church, and attentiveness to tasks were instilled from the very beginning. Childhood was precious, but it was not indulgent. Every gesture prepared a child for the demands that lay ahead. Outside the home, toddlers discovered the village itself. Narrow dirt lanes winding between cottages, the church standing tall at the center, the fields stretching outward. Walking with their mother to fetch water, a child might marvel at the sound of the smith's hammer or the smell of baking bread from a neighbor's oven. These sensory experiences imprinted on them the layout of their world, a small but rich landscape that defined the limits of their imagination. By age 3 or 4, a child was expected to take on small but real duties. Carrying water in tiny buckets, gathering kindling, shooing birds from seed beds, such tasks were both work and initiation. Each success was met with praise, each failure a chance to learn. Through these lessons, toddlers became children ready to take their place in the household economy. But despite the expectations, there was room for joy. Childhood laughter echoed across fields and cottages. Toddlers clung to their mother's skirts, raced with siblings through the village green, or curled up to listen to stories told at night. The warmth of family, the rhythm of daily life, and the simplicity of play created moments of happiness, even amid hardship. First steps and first words in a medieval village were more than milestones. They marked the beginning of usefulness, the moment a child began to merge with the life of the community. To walk and to speak was to join in, to belong, to contribute. And though the world around them was often harsh, the sight of a child toddling across a dirt floor, clutching a stick or a rag doll, brought hope, a reminder that life continued, even in the most difficult of times. To truly understand the childhood of a medieval village, one must look closely at the family, for it was the foundation of survival. Every child was born into a network of kinship, where each member, young or old, carried responsibilities that bound them together. The family was not just a unit of affection. It was an economic engine, a shelter, and a training ground. Childhood unfolded within this structure, shaped by duties, expectations, and bonds that reached across generations. A medieval peasant household was usually crowded. Families often lived in small, one-room cottages made of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs and a smoky hearth at the center. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Children slept alongside parents, siblings, and sometimes even grandparents, with straw pallets spread on the floor. Livestock, chickens, goats, or pigs were sometimes brought inside at night for warmth or protection, blurring the line between human and animal space. In this crowded environment, children grew up constantly surrounded by others. From their earliest days, they learned to share space, food, and labor. The family hierarchy was clear. The father is head, the mother is manager of the household, and children expected to respect and obey both. Authority was rarely questioned. To go against the will of one as parents risked not only punishment, but also shame in the eyes of the community, for obedience was seen as the mark of a well-raised child. For fathers, their primary role was to provide and protect, but they also guided their sons in the skills of farming, craft, or trade. A boy might follow his father to the fields, carrying small tools or watching as the plow cut furrows through the earth. Fathers instructed through demonstration, not lectures. Watching the sowing of seed, the sharpening of a scythe, or the repair of a fence, sons absorbed the rhythm of work and the pride of craftsmanship. Mothers bore perhaps the heavier load, especially with young children. They not only gave birth and nursed, but also taught daughters the skills of keeping a home. Spinning, weaving, cooking, brewing, and tending the garden were all passed down through practice. A little girl sitting at her mother's side might first be given a small distaff with scraps of wool to twist, or a dull knife to slice vegetables. These tasks were not simply chores, but lessons in survival. Older siblings held an essential role in the family structure. With so many demands on the parents, the eldest children often became caretakers for the younger ones. An older sister might strap a baby to her back while she fetched water, or lead a toddler by the hand as she tended geese in the meadow. This apprenticeship of care fostered responsibility from an early age, and it helped strengthen sibling bonds. A boy might learn to whittle toys for his younger brothers, while a girl soothed crying infants with songs she herself had only just learned. Grandparents, when present, played a different but equally important role. Though too old for heavy labor, they became storytellers, advisors, and keepers of memory. Around the hearth in the evening, they might recount tales of past harvests, old family feuds, or local legends of saints and spirits. For children, grandparents connected them to the past, offering both comfort and wisdom. Within the family, roles were shaped by gender as much as by age. Boys were expected to take on outdoor tasks, tending animals, assisting in the fields, learning trade skills from their fathers or other male relatives. Girls were drawn into the domestic sphere, practicing cooking, weaving, and childcare. These divisions were not strict. Many families required flexibility, but from childhood onward, children were prepared for the adult roles society expected of them. Yet affection was present, even if it did not always resemble modern notions of parenthood. Parents loved their children, though they were keenly aware that death could claim them at any time. This awareness sometimes made affection cautious, but it did not erase it. Mothers comforted sick children, fathers praised sons who worked hard, and families gathered to celebrate baptisms, name days, and milestones. Love was woven into daily labor, expressed not through gifts or indulgence, but through shared survival. Discipline, however, was never far away. A child who shirked work, disobeyed orders, or showed disrespect could expect stern correction. Fathers might use the rod, and mothers a sharp tongue or swift smack. But punishment was not random. It reinforced order within the household and the community. A well-disciplined child reflected well on their family, while a rebellious one brought shame. Beyond the immediate family, children were part of a wider network of kinship. Cousins, aunts, and uncles often lived nearby, and the entire village could act as an extended family. Children moved freely between cottages, playing and helping wherever needed. A child's misbehavior was not only their parents' concern. Neighbors might scold or correct them too. The sense of collective responsibility meant that everyone had a hand in shaping the younger generation. For medieval children, family life was never passive. It was a living web of duties, loyalties, and affections, where each person contributed according to their ability. The family was their school, their workplace, and their sanctuary. To belong to a family was to have a place in the world, and to be without one an orphan or foundling was among the hardest fates a child could endure. Growing up in such households, children learned the rhythms of work, the importance of obedience, and the warmth of companionship. The cottage might have been small and the meals meager, but within those walls, children absorbed the values that would carry them into adulthood. The lessons of family life were simple but enduring: to respect elders, to share burdens, to care for the weak, and to take pride in fulfilling one's role. In this way, the medieval family shaped not just childhood, but the very identity of each person who lived within it. For the child, it was both cradle and forge, a place of nurture and discipline, of affection and demand, preparing them for the harsh yet sustaining world of the village beyond. For a child in a medieval village, the world was at once small and vast. Small because most never traveled far beyond a few miles from their birthplace, yet vast because every corner of the village seemed alive with mystery, sound, and activity. The environment of the village was both a playground and a workplace, shaping how children saw the world and how they learned to move within it. A typical medieval village was modest in size, often no more than a cluster of 30 to 60 families. At its heart stood the church, its spire or bell tower rising above thatched roofs, a constant reminder of faith and community. For children, the churchyard was a familiar place, sometimes solemn during services, but also a gathering space where games might break out when the priest's watchful eye turned away. The cottages that formed the body of the village were simple, built from timber frames, wattle and daub walls, and roofs thick with straw. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the smell of hearth fires mingled with the scent of animals. To a child, each cottage was not only a home but a landmark, the place where their best friend lived, the spot where a grandmother spun wool, the corner where the smith's hammer rang through the air. Narrow dirt lanes wound between these homes, muddy in spring, dusty in summer, frozen in winter. Children knew every rut and puddle, every twist and turn, for these lanes were their highways. Along them they chased one another, rolled hoops, or dragged sticks in play. Along them, too, they trudged on errands, balancing pails of water or bundles of wood, careful not to spill or drop what they carried. Fields stretched outward from the village in a patchwork of strips-long, narrow pieces of land worked by individual families but bound together by communal rules. For children, the fields were places of learning and labor. Boys helped scare crows from the grain, waving sticks or clapping boards to keep the birds away. Girls might gather herbs at the field edges or pick up stray stalks after harvest. In summer, the fields hummed with life, a vast green sea where children darted and played under the sun. Livestock also defined the village landscape. Cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens were essential to survival, and children were often tasked with herding or guarding them. Leading geese to pasture or watching pigs forage in the woods became daily adventures. To a child, animals were both companions and responsibilities. A lost sheep or broken fence could mean real hardship for the family, so children quickly learned vigilance. The village green was another focal point. This open space hosted gatherings, festivals, and sometimes markets. On ordinary days, it became the playground of children, a place to run, wrestle, or practice games. On feast days, it came alive with music, dancing, and the clamor of voices. Children absorbed the rhythms of community here, witnessing both the joy of celebration and the seriousness of public announcements or judgments. Beyond the green, the village was ringed with woods, meadows, and streams. These borders were both enticing and dangerous. Forests promised berries, nuts, and firewood, but they also held the threat of wolves, bandits, or simply getting lost. Streams offered water and fish, but also posed a risk of drowning for the unwary. Parents warned their children sternly, but curiosity was strong. Many childhood adventures began at the edge of these forbidden spaces, with whispered dares and the thrill of stepping just a little too far. Inside the village, sensory experiences abounded. The clatter of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the chatter of women spinning in doorways, all of it created a living soundscape. The air carried the smells of bread baking, dung drying, and ale brewing. For children, these smells and sounds became the background of memory, binding them to place as surely as family did. The environment of the medieval village was also a place of constant work. Children absorbed its rhythms from dawn to dusk. The ringing of the church bell marked not only hours of prayer, but also the passing of time for chores and meals. Sunrise meant fetching water, tending animals, or following parents to the fields. Evening meant gathering around the hearth, stories told in flickering firelight, the world outside dark and hushed. But amidst duty, there was wonder. A child lying in the grass might gaze at the sweep of stars overhead, unspoiled by city lights. A girl gathering flowers at the edge of the meadow might weave them into a garland, placing it proudly on her head. A boy watching a blacksmith shape glowing metal might dream of becoming a craftsman himself. Every lane, every stream, every tree held possibility. The village was not just a backdrop, it was a teacher. Its fields taught patience and labor, its church taught reverence, its animals taught care and responsibility. Its boundaries taught caution, and its open green taught community. For a medieval child, to know the village was to know the world, and though that world was small, it was complete. In the medieval village, childhood was not a long sanctuary of play, but a brief preparation for duty. From the moment a child could walk steadily and understand instructions, they began to shoulder tasks, first small and symbolic, later heavy with responsibility. Work was not seen as punishment, but as the natural way of life, and children learned early that their survival and their family's survival depended on their contribution. A boy of 5 might already be helping his father in the fields. He would not yet handle a plow or scythe, but he could carry water to thirsty oxen, gather stones from the furrows, or chase away crows from the young grain. Standing barefoot in the soil, waving his arms to frighten off the birds, he would feel himself part of the great cycle of planting and harvest. Each task, however small, was preparation for the day when he would shoulder the full weight of farm labor. Girls were expected to help just as early, though their work was more often tied to the household. A little girl might carry kindling for the fire, stir the pottage under her mother's watchful eye, or learn to spin wool using a simple spindle. She might also watch her younger siblings, rocking a cradle with her foot while her hands worked at another task. From the start, her duties prepared her for future roles of wife and mother, teaching patience, diligence, and care. Animal care was often entrusted to children. Boys and girls alike could be sent to watch the family's flock of geese, herd goats to the edge of the woods, or keep pigs from straying into the wrong fields. This task was at once tedious and freeing. Children spent long hours outdoors, sometimes with companions, sometimes alone. They learned to whistle commands, throw clods of earth to guide animals, and recognize the signs of danger. At the same time, they found ways to make the hours pass whittling sticks, weaving flowers, or inventing games. By the age of 7, children were considered capable of real labor. Sons were expected to help with heavier field tasks, hoeing weeds, carrying loads of grain, or gathering the harvest. Daughters might join their mothers in grinding grain, brewing ale, or weaving cloth. Their small hands were nimble, well suited for tasks like threading looms or picking peas. The transition from play to work was gradual, but by this age, childhood had already begun to resemble adulthood in miniature. Work was not always limited to the family's needs. Children sometimes earned wages or food by serving others. A poor family might send a son to help a wealthier neighbor tend sheep in exchange for a meal. A daughter might be sent to assist with baking or brewing, learning new skills while contributing to the household's survival. These early forms of service foreshadowed the apprenticeships and domestic work that many children would take on as they grew older. The seasonal rhythm of village life dictated the intensity of children's work. Spring meant long days in the fields planting seed. Summer brought endless tasks of weeding and watering. Autumn was filled with the exhausting work of harvest, and winter, though slower, demanded preparation of food, mending, and care for livestock. Each season had its duties, and children felt them as keenly as adults. But work was not without its dangers. Tools were sharp, animals unpredictable, and weather harsh. A child might cut themselves on a scythe, be gored by a startled ox, or fall ill after long hours in the cold. Parents knew the risks, yet necessity often outweighed caution. Children learned resilience, and those who survived gained the toughness that life demanded. Though demanding, work also offered pride. A boy who brought home firewood without spilling his load earned his father's praise. A girl who spun a neat thread or baked a loaf without burning, it saw her mother's approving nod. In a world where survival was precarious, competence was valued, and children quickly discovered the satisfaction of being useful. Still, amidst work, there was laughter. Children sang as they weeded, played games while herding animals, or carved little toys while resting in the fields. Work and play were not separate categories, but woven together. The boundaries between duty and amusement blurred, making even the hardest days bearable. For medieval children, learning to work was learning to live. Every task prepared them for adulthood, when the survival of a family might rest on their shoulders. To modern eyes, it may seem harsh that such young children labored so diligently, but within the village, it was seen as natural and necessary. Childhood was not a time set apart, but an apprenticeship for life. By the time a child reached 10 or 12, They were no longer considered children in the way we think of the term. They were workers, contributors, and in many respects, young adults. The lessons of early work forged resilience, skill, and identity. Through chores, herding, and craft, children found their place in the fabric of village life, proving that even the smallest hands could carry the weight of survival. For children in a medieval village, food was not only sustenance, but also a constant measure of fortune and hardship. Meals were shaped by the rhythm of the seasons, the success of the harvest, and the resources of the family. Unlike today, where childhood diets might include a wide range of flavors and indulgences, medieval children ate what the land provided, often in simple and repetitive forms. Yet even these modest meals carried their own rituals, lessons, and comforts. The staple of nearly every meal was bread. Coarse, dense, and dark, it was made from rye, barley, oats, or a mixture of grains. Only the wealthier villagers might enjoy bread made from wheat, for wheat was expensive and difficult to cultivate in poorer soils. For children, bread was both food and tool. A slice might serve as a plate for pottage or as a scoop for broth. Little ones gnawed on crusts softened in ale or milk, while older children carried hunks of bread into the fields as their midday meal. Alongside bread, pottage was a constant. This thick stew of peas, beans, lentils, and whatever vegetables were at hand simmered in a large pot over the hearth. Day after day, it formed the backbone of the diet. For children, the taste of pottage became the taste of home, flavored with onions, leeks, cabbage, or turnips, sometimes enriched with scraps of bacon or drippings if the family could afford it. The smell of it bubbling in the pot was familiar and comforting, though its sameness might weary even the hungriest child. Meat was rare in peasant households, reserved for feast days or times of plenty. Children might taste pork or chicken at Christmas or Easter, or share in a communal ox slaughtered for a festival. More often, meat came in the form of salted or smoked scraps, added to pottage for flavor. Fish, when available, supplemented the diet, especially during Lent and other church-imposed fasts when meat was forbidden. For children, the excitement of eating meat was memorable, a treat to be savored slowly. Dairy products provided another important source of nourishment. Milk from cows or goats, often turned quickly into cheese or butter, was essential. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so children usually consumed it in the form of soft cheese or curds. Butter, when available, was spread thinly on bread, making it richer and easier to swallow. Eggs, gathered from hens or geese, were valued treasures, often eaten boiled or scrambled into pottage. Seasonality shaped every bite. In spring, children tasted young greens, nettles, and herbs gathered from hedgerows. Summer brought berries, apples, and nuts, sweet gifts from the land. Autumn was the season of plenty, harvest grains, root vegetables, and fruits stored for winter. Children eagerly joined in gathering apples or nuts, sneaking bites while helping fill baskets. But winter was lean. With fresh food scarce, meals turned to stored grain, dried peas, salted meat, and whatever could be preserved. Hunger was sharpest then, and children learned quickly that survival meant careful rationing. Meals were usually taken communally. In the one-room cottage, the family gathered around the hearth or a simple wooden table. Children sat alongside parents, often on stools or the floor, eating from shared bowls or trenchers made of stale bread. Hands, not utensils, were the main tools, though wooden spoons might be used for broth. The act of eating together reinforced family bonds, and children learned early to wait their turn, respect their elders, and not waste food. Hunger was a constant shadow in medieval life. Bad harvests, harsh winters, or outbreaks of disease among crops or animals could bring famine. For children, hunger was more than discomfort. It was a formative experience, teaching resilience and patience. Parents often sacrificed their own portions to feed their young, but even so, Many children grew thin during lean years. Those who survived carried the lessons of scarcity with them into adulthood, forever mindful of the fragility of plenty. Drinks were simple. Ale, weak and watered down, was safer than untreated water, which might carry disease. Even children drank this small ale, barely intoxicating but nourishing. Milk, when available, was given to the youngest. Water from wells or streams was drunk too, though always with some caution. Sweet drinks were virtually unknown, making honey a rare delight, sometimes added to cakes or festival treats. Food also carried social meaning. Wealthier villagers might enjoy more variety, including spices, honey, or better quality meat, and children noticed these differences. At feast days, children from poorer families looked in wonder at tables groaning with roasted meats, pies, and pastries. Such experiences widened their sense of possibility, even if only briefly. Despite hardship, food was also a source of joy. Children delighted in simple treats: an apple plucked from an orchard, a handful of berries gathered on the edge of the woods, a honey cake baked for a holy day. Festivals and fairs provided sweetmeats, roasted nuts, or spiced breads, moments when taste burst beyond the ordinary. These rare indulgences left deep impressions, stories to be remembered long after the last bite was gone. Learning about food was part of growing up. Daughters helped their mothers grind grain, knead dough, and stir pottage. Sons joined their fathers in slaughtering animals, smoking meat, or gathering harvests. Children were taught to identify edible herbs, mushrooms, and plants from the hedgerows. Mistakes could be deadly, so this knowledge was passed on carefully, often through rhyme, story, or practice. Food also had a spiritual dimension. Grace was said before meals, and fast days imposed by the church shaped diets throughout the year. Children learned not only what to eat, but when it was permitted. Lent, Advent, and numerous saints' days created rhythms of abstinence and celebration, teaching discipline alongside appetite. In many ways, food defined childhood itself. To be a child in a medieval village was to live with the daily awareness of hunger, the gratitude of enough, and the joy of occasional abundance. Meals were not just nourishment. They were lessons in patience, humility, and resilience. Around the shared pot and bread loaf, children learned what it meant to belong to a family, a village, and a fragile but enduring way of life. For a medieval child, clothing was not a matter of fashion or personal expression, but of necessity, practicality, and survival. In a world where winters were long, summers often harsh, and resources scarce, garments were precious and carefully managed. A child's appearance spoke volumes about their family's means, their role in the household, and their place in the community. Most children wore what amounted to miniature versions of adult clothing. There was no special children's fashion in the modern sense. Instead, garments were scaled down and simplified. The basic piece was the tunic, a long, loose garment made of wool or linen, reaching to the knees or sometimes longer. In summer, a simple linen shift might suffice, light and breathable against the heat. In winter, thicker woolen tunics, layered one atop another, provided warmth. Hand-me-downs were the rule. A new garment was rarely made for a child, unless it was absolutely necessary. Instead, clothes were passed from older siblings to younger, patched and re-sewn countless times. A boy might wear a tunic originally made for his father, cut down and refitted by his mother. A girl's dress might once have belonged to an older sister or even a cousin. To medieval families, fabric was too valuable to waste. Children grew up wearing garments that carried the visible marks of their family's thrift. Shoes were a luxury. Many children went barefoot through much of the year, their soles toughened from dirt roads and fields. In colder months, simple leather shoes or wooden clogs were worn if available. Some children stuffed their shoes with straw for insulation. Wealthier villagers might afford better footwear, but for most, Bare feet were a common sight, especially among the young. Wool was the most common fabric, spun and woven at home. It was warm, durable, and relatively accessible. Linen, made from flax, was also widely used, especially for undergarments and summer wear. Colors were usually muted: browns, grays, and dull greens, dyed with natural materials from plants or roots. Bright colors were rare and often signaled wealth. If a child wore a red or blue garment, even a faded one, it stood out in the crowd. Clothing also revealed gender roles. Boys wore short tunics, sometimes belted, with hose or simple trousers as they grew older. Girls wore longer tunics or dresses, often with aprons. Hair, too, reflected expectations. Boys might have it cut short for practicality, while girls wore it long, braided, or covered with simple caps as they approached adolescence. These visual markers helped the community immediately recognize a child's role and stage of life. Appearance was not only about fabric, but also about cleanliness or the lack of it. In villages where water had to be fetched from wells or streams, frequent washing of garments was impractical. Children often wore the same clothing for days or weeks, patched and mended as needed. Dirt was a familiar companion, clinging to hems and sleeves. For villagers, this was not a mark of shame but of labor. To see a child with muddy tunic hems was to see a child who had been working or playing outdoors, as expected. Still, care was taken to preserve garments as long as possible. Mothers taught daughters to mend tiers, re-sew seams, and patch holes. A tunic might carry patches upon patches, each one a testament to thrift and survival. Children grew up understanding that clothing was not disposable, but precious, requiring effort to maintain. Festive occasions, however, called for better dress. For feast days, weddings, or church festivals, families brought out their finest garments. Children might be given cleaner tunics, brightly dyed ribbons, or simple garlands of flowers to wear. For many, this was the only time they saw themselves in new clothing, even if it was only newly patched or carefully brushed. The contrast between everyday work clothes and festival attire made these moments all the more special. Practicality shaped every detail of the child's clothing. Sleeves were often long to provide warmth, sometimes tied back to keep them out of the way during work. Belts or cord-cinched tunics, doubling as places to hang small tools or pouches. In colder regions, cloaks or hoods were added, offering protection from wind and rain. A hood, often with a long tail called a liripipe, was especially common, serving as both head covering and scarf. Jewelry and adornments were rare among village children. Perhaps a small wooden cross on a string, or a charm tied around the neck for protection. Wealthier families might provide a child with a simple metal brooch or belt buckle, but for most, decoration was natural. Flowers woven into hair, garlands made from meadow plants, or colored threads sewn into hems by loving hands. Appearance also held symbolic weight. The church encouraged modesty, and parents taught children to dress appropriately for worship. A clean face and tidy hair on Sunday were signs of respect, no matter how patched the clothing. Children learned early that appearance was part of moral instruction. Sloppiness could reflect poorly, not only on themselves, but on their family. The seasons shaped clothing as much as necessity. In summer, barefoot children ran in thin tunics, their skin browned by the sun. In winter, they bundled in layers of wool, huddling close to the hearth when indoors, and braving the chill when out with animals or fetching water. Mothers often reminded children to keep their cloaks wrapped tight, knowing that a winter chill could quickly become illness. To modern eyes, medieval children might have seemed perpetually underdressed, their garments coarse, patched, and plain. Yet within those clothes lay the story of resilience. Each stitch, each patch, each threadbare sleeve reflected the work of hands determined to make limited resources last. Children grew up not with wardrobes, but with one or two sets of garments, learning to live not in abundance, but in sufficiency. And yet, In their simple clothing, children played, worked, and thrived. Barefoot in the fields, cloaked against the cold, patched tunics billowing in the wind, they grew up within the fabric of necessity, learning not only to accept it, but to take pride in it. Their appearance was not about standing out, but about belonging, woven into the same humble patterns as the land, the seasons, and the lives of their families. When we think of education today, we imagine classrooms, textbooks, and long years of structured schooling. For a child in a medieval village, however, education looked very different. Most never saw the inside of a formal school, nor did they own a single book. Yet their days were filled with constant learning, practical, oral, and deeply tied to survival. Knowledge passed not through paper and ink, but through memory, observation, and imitation. The first and most important classroom was the home. From the moment a child could walk and talk, they were immersed in the lessons of family life. A boy learned by watching his father how to yoke an ox, mend a fence, or shape wood with a simple knife. A girl learned by shadowing her mother how to grind grain, spin wool, or prepare a stew with whatever ingredients were at hand. These were not abstract lessons. They were rehearsals for the very tasks that would define adult life. Oral tradition formed the backbone of early education. Parents, siblings, and grandparents instructed children through spoken word, commands, warnings, prayers, and stories. Knowledge was encoded in proverbs and rhymes, easy to remember and repeat. A child might learn a saying about planting crops, a charm against illness, or a tale of saints and heroes, all of which carried practical or moral instruction. In a largely illiterate world, memory was the library, and the human voice was the book. The church played a central role in more formal learning. Almost every village had a parish church, and children grew up hearing Latin prayers at Mass, even if they did not understand the words. Priests and clerks sometimes offered rudimentary instruction, teaching boys their letters so they could read scripture or chant prayers. Girls were less likely to receive such lessons, though they too absorbed religious knowledge through attendance at services and participation in holy days. For those families with greater means, or for particularly gifted boys, there might be access to a village school or a monastic school nearby. There, a child might learn to read and write Latin, to chant psalms, and to copy texts. Instruction was strict, often involving rote memorization and corporal punishment for mistakes. To be literate was rare among peasants, but even a little schooling could elevate a child's prospects, opening doors to the church, administration, or trade. Most children, however, never held a quill or inkpot. Instead, they developed a different kind of literacy, a fluency in the language of labor, land, and community. A boy could read the weather in the sky, the health of an ox in its gait, or the fertility of soil in its color. A girl could judge the readiness of dough by its snow, the quality of wool by its feel, or the strength of ale by its taste. These forms of knowledge were just as crucial as reading words on a page, for they sustained daily life. Apprenticeship was another key form of education. Around the age of 10 or 12, boys might be sent to live with a master craftsman, perhaps a blacksmith, carpenter, or cooper. There, they learned a trade step by step, starting with menial tasks like sweeping floors or fetching tools, gradually advancing to skilled work. Apprenticeship was not only about learning a craft, but also about learning discipline, patience, and the social codes of the village. Girls, too, could be apprenticed, often in domestic service, weaving, or spinning. In such roles, they absorbed both technical skills and the rhythms of managing a household. Discipline was strict in all forms of education. Mistakes were corrected quickly, often with a sharp word or a switch. In the home, disobedience could bring a cuff from a parent. In the church school, a mispronounced Latin phrase might earn a beating from the rod. Children were expected to learn not only the task, but also obedience itself, for obedience was seen as the foundation of virtue. Despite the sternness, learning was not joyless. Children found pride in new skills. A boy carving his first usable wooden spoon, a girl weaving her first piece of cloth, a child reciting a prayer without stumbling. These small victories built confidence and identity. For many, learning was woven into play, counting stones, singing rhymes, or imitating the actions of adults. In the village, play and instruction blurred, for even games could prepare children for their roles in life. The knowledge children gained also extended to the unseen world. Folklore, superstitions, and charms were passed down as seriously as farming or cooking skills. A child learned which herbs could ease a fever, which prayers protected against storms, and which rituals guarded against evil spirits. These teachings were part of the invisible armor that helped a family face the uncertainties of life. Books, when they appeared, seemed almost magical. A child in a village might glimpse one in the hands of a priest or a visiting noble, marveling at the painted letters and intricate illustrations. To hold a book was rare, to read one rarer still. Yet the awe of books reinforced the sense that knowledge carried weight and mystery, even if it was not accessible to all. In essence, education for a medieval child was a tapestry woven from family, faith, and necessity. They learned what was needed to survive, to belong, and to continue the traditions of their people. Few could recite poetry or calculate sums, but they could harness oxen, weave cloth, brew ale, or recite prayer skills that mattered most in the world they inhabited. To modern eyes, such an education may seem limited. Yet for the medieval child, it was abundant with meaning, tied directly to life itself. Their lessons were not found in books, but in the soil beneath their feet, the stories by the fire, the chants in the church, and the patient repetition of work beside parent or master. Every day, in every action, they were students, and the village itself was their school. For a child in a medieval village, religion was not an occasional presence, but the very framework of existence. The church towered physically and spiritually over their world. From the moment of baptism, their life was tied to the rhythms of the Christian calendar, the teachings of the parish priest, and the rituals that bound the community together. Spiritual life was not something they chose. It was woven into every day, shaping their earliest memories and their deepest fears. The church stood at the center of the village, both geographically and symbolically. To a child, its bells marked the passage of time. They rang for morning mass, for midday prayer, for evening rest, for feast days and funerals. Children learned to measure their days by this sound: when to rise, when to pray, when to work, when to gather. The sight of the steeple against the sky was a constant reminder that God's presence overshadowed even the humblest cottage. From infancy, children were brought into the fold of religious practice. Baptism, often performed within days of birth, was considered essential, for unbaptized souls were thought to be denied heaven. Mothers and fathers carried their infants to the stone font, where the priest poured holy water over the tiny head, tracing the sign of the cross. For parents, this was a moment of relief as much as celebration. Their child's soul was safe, whatever happened next. Daily life was filled with smaller religious practices. A child grew up hearing grace before meals, prayers before bed, and blessings on journeys. They were taught the sign of the cross almost as soon as they could move their hands with intention. Mothers whispered prayers for protection while tucking children into bed, while fathers led them in morning blessings before work in the fields. These rituals became as natural as breathing. The Christian calendar provided a rhythm of feast and fast that shaped children's experiences. Advent, Lent, Easter, Christmas each brought its own traditions, foods, and ceremonies. During Lent, children learned the discipline of abstaining from meat, even if their diet was meager already. At Christmas and Easter, the joy of feasting filled their memories with warmth. Feast days of saints brought festivals, processions, and games, moments when the sacred blended with celebration. Attendance at Mass was obligatory, and even restless children were expected to sit or kneel quietly during the long Latin services. They might not understand the words, but the atmosphere, the flickering candles, the smell of incense, the rise and fall of chant made a lasting impression. For many, the mystery of the church service was their first encounter with awe, with something greater than themselves. Confession and catechism came as children grew older. They were instructed in the basic prayers, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Creed. Learning these by heart was both a spiritual and educational milestone. Children confessed sins like disobedience, lying, or stealing apples, guided by the priest toward penance and forgiveness. These rituals taught them not only morality, but also the sense of accountability to both God and community. Religion also colored how children viewed the unseen world. They were taught about angels and demons, heaven and hell. Parents and priests alike reminded them that good behavior pleased God and led to salvation, while sin invited punishment. Tales of saints who performed miracles or martyrs who endured suffering provided examples of courage and virtue. At the same time, warnings about the devil, witches, and sinful temptations instilled fear that shaped behavior. Superstition blurred with faith in daily life. Children wore charms or amulets blessed by priests, meant to ward off illness or misfortune. They might be told not to wander near crossroads at night for fear of spirits, or to say a prayer when passing a churchyard to honor the dead. To young minds, the world was alive with both holy protection and lurking dangers. Religion offered a map through this unseen landscape, guiding them with prayers and rituals. Community worship reinforced belonging. A child kneeling beside parents and neighbors felt part of something larger than their family. On feast days, they joined processions, carrying flowers or banners, their small voices rising in hymns with the rest of the village. The sight of the entire community gathered in prayer impressed upon them the strength of unity and faith. As children grew, their roles in religious life expanded. Boys might serve as altar boys, learning to light candles, carry crosses, or assist the priest. Girls might weave garlands for saints' days or help clean the church. These contributions gave children a sense of purpose, drawing them deeper into the life of faith. Religion also provided solace during hardship. In times of sickness, famine, or death, children turned with their families to prayer. They knelt before images of the Virgin Mary, saints, or the crucifix, seeking comfort. The churchyard, with its graves and crosses, was a constant reminder of mortality. For children who lost siblings or parents, the promise of heaven offered hope amidst grief. Ultimately, religion gave medieval children both structure and meaning. It explained why the seasons turned, why suffering existed, and what their place was in the grand order of things. It taught them obedience, humility, and community, while also offering joy in festivals and comfort in sorrow. To live as a child in a medieval village was to live under the shadow of the church, where every day, every action was touched by the sacred. Though medieval childhood was filled with labor and responsibility, it was not without joy, play, and laughter. Work shaped life in the village, but even within that structure, children found time to create games, invent amusements, and enjoy moments of freedom. Entertainment for a child in a medieval village was simple, often improvised from the natural world or crafted from scraps, but it carried the same spirit of delight and imagination that children express today. The most common playthings were toys fashioned from wood, cloth, or bone. A boy might have a carved wooden sword or a small bow, both a game and a rehearsal for the skills he would one day need as a defender of the household. A girl might cradle a rag doll sewn from leftover cloth, its face marked with a few stitches or painted features. Dolls could also be made of clay or carved from wood, and though simple, they carried profound meaning. In them, little girls practiced the roles of care, nurturing, and imitation of their mothers. Balls, too, were popular. Children made them from stitched scraps of leather, stuffed with wool or rags. Ball games might be played in the village green, where groups of children chased, kicked, or tossed them. Rules were often loose, changing with the moment, but the energy and laughter were constant. Some of these games, rough and chaotic, foreshadowed medieval versions of football, which was as much a brawl as a sport. Other games relied on nothing more than imagination. Pebbles could be used in counting games or tossed in competitions of skill. Sticks became swords, horses, or tools for digging in the dirt. Hoops rolled down lanes, chased by children running barefoot. Simple spinning tops carved from wood amused both boys and girls. Even bones from Meal's sheep's knuckles, for example, were repurposed into dice-like pieces used in games of chance or dexterity. Singing and clapping games were also common. Children learned rhymes and songs passed down through generations, often with repetitive rhythms that made them easy to remember. These songs might be sung while skipping, clapping hands, or dancing in circles. Music and rhythm were woven into daily life, and children's games reflected the melodies they heard in church or festivals. Seasonal celebrations offered the richest opportunities for entertainment. At harvest time, children joined in feasts, dances, and games that spilled into the village green. At midsummer, bonfires were lit, and children ran around them, laughing and shouting. On May Day, they might gather flowers, weave garlands, or dance around a pole decorated with ribbons. Festivals allowed even the poorest children to experience joy and abundance, if only for a day. Winter brought its own amusements. On frozen ponds or streams, children slid on the ice, sometimes using bones strapped to their shoes as primitive skates. Indoors, by the hearth, they played quiet games with dice, sang songs, or listened to stories told by elders. The flicker of firelight, the sound of wind outside, and the warmth of shared laughter made these moments as treasured as any summer game. Competition played a natural role in entertainment. Children raced across fields, wrestled in the grass, or tested strength in tug-of-war. Boys practiced mock battles with sticks, while girls competed in spinning or weaving contests. These games were not only fun, but also training for adult skills, speed, strength, dexterity, and endurance. The line between play and preparation blurred, making every game an opportunity for growth. Animals, too, became part of entertainment. Children chased chickens, raced dogs, or guided geese through playful obstacles. A calf or lamb might become a companion, doted on and treated almost as a pet. Though animals were primarily sources of food and labor, children formed bonds with them, finding in their antics moments of laughter and affection. Not all entertainment was physical. Storytelling was one of the most beloved pastimes, and children eagerly gathered to listen to tales by the fire. Stories of saints, heroes, and local legends mixed with folk tales of fairies, goblins, and enchanted animals. These tales fired the imagination, carrying children beyond the boundaries of the village into worlds of magic and morality. Older children often retold these stories to younger ones, keeping traditions alive. Mimicry was another form of play. Children imitated adults, pretending to plow fields, bake bread, or conduct trade. Boys might stage mock church services, chanting like priests, while girls arranged dolls in households, mimicking mothers. Through such imitation, children both entertained themselves and rehearsed for the roles they would soon inhabit. Entertainment was not always innocent, however. Some games carried risks. Rough football matches left bruises, sliding on ice led to falls, and mock battles occasionally caused real injuries. Parents scolded, but children returned to play nonetheless, for joy was too precious to abandon. In the end, the entertainment of medieval children was marked by simplicity, creativity, and community. With few material possessions, they made their own fun from what the world offered. Play was woven into the fabric of work and faith, providing relief from hardship and joy amid responsibility. In laughter on the village green, in stories by the fire, in songs sung while skipping through lanes, children carved out moments of delight that made their brief childhoods rich and memorable. Beyond family and work, friendships formed the heart of childhood in a medieval village. For children, bonds with peers offered companionship, laughter, and shared experience in a world that often demanded more responsibility than play. Though daily life was shaped by duties and discipline, friendships gave children a sense of belonging that reached beyond the walls of their cottages. From the earliest years, children played alongside neighbors' sons and daughters. Villages were small, and most children grew up surrounded by the same group of peers from birth to adulthood. Friendships formed naturally as children fetched water from the same well, tended animals in adjoining fields, or played in the same dusty lanes. These bonds often lasted a lifetime, strengthened by the shared rhythm of village life. Play was the glue of friendship. Children invented games, sang songs together, and shared toys, however simple. A boy might lend his carved wooden horse to a companion, while a girl shared her rag doll or taught a friend a new weaving rhyme. Group games like tag, wrestling, or ball games required trust and camaraderie, creating bonds forged in laughter and competition. But friendship extended beyond amusement. Children worked together too, and in this cooperation, ties deepened. Herding geese, weeding fields, or gathering firewood became easier and more enjoyable when done with a friend. Side by side, they learned the values of teamwork, patience, and shared responsibility. A child might help another with chores, knowing the favor would be returned. Secrets and confidences also blossomed among friends. In whispered tones, children shared fears of punishment, dreams of adventure, or tales they had overheard from adults. They confided hopes about the future. A boy speaking of apprenticing as a blacksmith, a girl imagining her marriage. These confidences gave children a sense of identity and trust beyond the family, allowing them to see themselves as individuals within a wider world. The church and festivals provided special opportunities for friendships to flourish. On feast days, when the village gathered for dancing, games, and shared meals, children mingled more freely. Friendships strengthened as they ran races, wove flower garlands, or joined in circle dances. In these moments of joy, bonds were sealed with laughter, songs, and shared delight in rare abundance. Friendships could also cross the boundaries of class, though not always easily. A peasant child might play with the son of a reeve or a minor landholder, but differences in clothing, food, and opportunity soon became clear. Still, in the innocence of play, these distinctions sometimes faded, if only temporarily. The village's small size often made contact inevitable, and shared experiences could soften the divides of status. Of course, not all friendships were harmonious. Quarrels erupted over toys, games, or perceived slights. Fistfights or shoving matches were not uncommon, and children sometimes carried grudges. Yet the close-knit nature of village life meant reconciliation was necessary. Children quickly learned to navigate conflict, for avoiding one another was nearly impossible. These disputes and their resolutions became lessons in compromise and forgiveness. Friendship also prepared children for adult bonds. Boys who played and worked together might one day labor side by side in the fields or serve together as villagers, representatives. Girls who shared dolls and secrets often became women who supported one another in childbirth, spinning circles, or times of hardship. Childhood friendships were the foundation of adult alliances, strengthening the web of community ties. Even the smallest acts reflected these bonds. Sharing a crust of bread, helping a friend climb a tree, or offering comfort after punishment all spoke of loyalty and kindness. In times of sickness, children brought flowers or herbs to a bedridden friend. When famine or hardship struck, friendships became lifelines as families leaned on one another and children mirrored their parents' generosity. For some children, early experiences of affection and loyalty shaded into the first stirrings of romance. Puppy love bloomed in bashful glances at festivals or in the teasing of boys and girls herding animals together. Though marriages were arranged and practical, the seeds of attraction often sprouted in these early friendships. Many adults could trace their bonds back to the lanes and fields of childhood. The loss of friends was a harsh reality. Disease, famine, or accidents could claim a playmate suddenly. Children learned to grieve early, standing beside parents in the churchyard as small graves were dug. Friendships made the pain sharper, but also more meaningful. The memory of a lost friend lingered, shaping a child's sense of life's fragility and the value of every bond. In the end, friendships in a medieval village were not luxuries but necessities. They provided joy amidst labor, comfort amidst hardship, and identity amidst conformity. For children, friends were co-workers, playmates, confidants, and future allies. In their laughter on the village green, their whispered secrets in shadowed corners, and their shared tasks in the fields, the bonds of friendship wove children into the greater fabric of community, teaching them lessons of loyalty, resilience, and love that lasted well beyond childhood. For children in a medieval village, the passage of time was not measured by clocks or calendars, but by the turning of the seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter each carried their own work, play, and rituals. Childhood unfolded in this cycle, where the tasks of survival and the moments of joy changed with the weather, the harvest, and the festivals of the year. Spring was a season of awakening, when fields that had lain fallow through the cold months burst into green. For children, it meant the start of long days outdoors. Boys might be sent to help their fathers sow seeds, scattering grain by hand across furrows. Girls helped their mothers gather herbs sprouting fresh at the edges of fields or plant vegetables in the household garden. Younger children chased birds from seedbeds, their clapping hands and shouts echoing across the fields. Play mingled with duty, while on watch for crows. Children wove garlands of flowers or skipped stones in streams swollen with meltwater. Spring also brought festivals tied to renewal. Easter was the most important, a season of solemn rituals, but also joyful feasts. Children joined processions, carried flowers to decorate the church, and marveled at the brighter foods that appeared after the lean days of Lent. May Day, too, offered revelry. Children danced in circles, crowned themselves with blossoms, and sang songs celebrating the return of warmth and growth. These festivals etched joy into their memories, marking spring as a time of hope. Summer was the season of work's greatest intensity, yet also of freedom. The long daylight hours stretched endlessly, allowing both labor and play. Older children labored in the fields, hoeing weeds, watering crops, and helping with haymaking. Herding animals often fell to children, who spent entire days guiding flocks to pasture, whittling sticks, singing, or playing games to pass the time. But summer also held moments of delight. Bathing in rivers or streams offered relief from heat, and even if forbidden by cautious parents, many children could not resist the lure of water. Meadows filled with wildflowers became playgrounds, and the endless buzz of insects and chirp of birds formed the soundtrack of their games. Festivals such as Midsummer's Eve filled the village green with bonfires, songs, and dancing. For children, the glow of flames and the laughter of the community created magical nights they never forgot. Autumn was the season of harvest, perhaps the busiest and most crucial time of year. Children's labor was indispensable. Even the youngest carried baskets of apples, gathered nuts, or picked up stray ears of grain left behind in the fields. Older boys and girls joined adults in reaping, threshing, and storing food for the coming winter. Days were long and exhausting, but the sense of purpose was clear. Survival depended on the success of these weeks. Yet autumn also brought reward. After the harvest, villages celebrated with feasts, games, and communal meals. Children relished the abundance fresh bread, roasted meats, and sweet fruits. They joined in dances and watched performances by traveling entertainers who sometimes visited during fairs. Harvest festivals blended hard work with joy, giving children a sense of both responsibility and reward. Winter was a season of contrasts, hardship and rest, scarcity and celebration. With fields bare and animals sheltered, daily labor eased somewhat. Children spent more time indoors, helping with spinning, weaving, mending clothes, or tending the hearth. They listened to stories by the fire, told by parents and grandparents, tales of saints, heroes, and strange creatures said to roam in the dark. Winter also brought play unique to the cold. Children slid on frozen ponds, threw snowballs, and built figures from snow when the weather allowed. Indoors, they played dice games, sang songs, or carved toys. But hunger often haunted the season. Stores of grain dwindled, and meals became meager. Children felt the bite of scarcity, learning patience and endurance. Despite hardship, winter festivals brought warmth. Christmas was a season of wonder. Decorated churches, the nativity story, and communal feasts where even the poorest children might taste meat or sweets. Candlemas, later in winter, brought light into the dark season. These celebrations reminded children that joy could be found even in lean times. The cycle of seasons taught children lessons as vital as any formal education. Spring taught hope and renewal. Summer taught diligence and endurance. Autumn taught responsibility and reward. Winter taught resilience and patience. Through these rhythms, children came to understand the balance of work and play, hardship and joy. To grow up in a medieval village was to live not by the tick of a clock, but by the rhythm of earth and sky. The turning seasons shaped their bodies, their habits, and their memories. Each year, as they grew older, children repeated the same tasks with greater skill and deeper understanding. The cycle of nature was the cycle of their childhood, each season leaving its mark on their hearts and minds. For a child in a medieval village, health was fragile and illness ever present. The world was filled with unseen dangers: contaminated water, spoiled food, infections from small wounds, and epidemics that swept through communities with terrifying speed. Childhood was precarious, and parents lived with the knowledge that sickness might claim a son or daughter at any moment. Survival was a constant battle, and the remedies of the time blending faith, folklore, and practical knowledge reflected both desperation and resilience. Infant and child mortality rates were heartbreakingly high. Many children never lived to see their 5th birthday. Simple illnesses such as fever, diarrhea, or coughs could quickly turn deadly in the absence of modern medicine. Malnutrition, particularly during harsh winters or poor harvest years, weakened young bodies, leaving them vulnerable to disease. Parents celebrated every birthday as a triumph, for each year survived brought a child closer to the strength of adulthood. The most common childhood illnesses included fevers, measles, whooping cough, and dysentery. Worms and parasites were nearly universal, causing pain and weakness. Skin infections, lice, and fleas were everyday companions, endured rather than cured. Wounds from play or work cuts, burns, bruises, could easily become infected. A small scratch, left untreated, might swell, fester, and lead to death. Famine and hunger also weakened children's health. During years of poor harvest, food scarcity led to malnutrition, stunted growth, and greater susceptibility to illness. Children often bore the brunt of these hardships, for their smaller bodies could not endure deprivation as well as adults. Parents sometimes gave up their own portions to feed their young, but still, hunger left its mark in hollow cheeks, thin limbs, and fragile strength. When sickness struck, families turned first to remedies passed down through generations. Mothers and grandmothers relied on herbs gathered from fields and hedgerows. Chamomile was brewed for fevers, mint for stomach pains, garlic for infections, and honey to soothe throats. Poultices of herbs were applied to wounds, and infusions given to drink. Some remedies had real medicinal value, while others offered comfort more than cure. Charms and superstitions played a large role as well. Children might wear amulets, bits of iron, carved crosses, or strings of herbs, believed to ward off evil spirits or illness. Prayers to saints were whispered over sickness. Candles lit before images of the Virgin Mary. Holy water was sprinkled, and relics, if available, touched to the child. Illness was often seen not only as a physical affliction, but as a spiritual trial, requiring both medicine and faith. Village healers, often women skilled in herbs and lore, provided care when families could not manage alone. They set broken bones, brewed stronger remedies, or offered charms. Some healers were respected. Others were eyed with suspicion, accused of witchcraft when their cures failed or seemed too strange. Yet for many children, these women were the only hope of recovery. The church also played a role in healing. Priests performed blessings of the sick, recited prayers, and encouraged confession and penance, believing sin could weaken the body as well as the soul. Pilgrimages to holy sites were sometimes made in search of miraculous cures, though such journeys were rare for poor villagers. Still, stories of healing saints filled children's imaginations, giving them hope even in times of sickness. Daily hygiene was minimal by modern standards. Water had to be fetched and heated, making frequent bathing impractical. Children might be washed occasionally, but dirt and grime were a constant. Clothes were worn until worn out, often patched rather than cleaned. Parasites flourished in this environment, accepted as part of life. Children scratched at lice, shared straw bedding with fleas, and endured rashes from irritation. Despite these hardships, resilience was remarkable. Children accustomed to rough conditions developed strong tolerance for discomfort. Scrapes and bruises healed on their own, and even in illness, many endured through sheer toughness. Parents' constant vigilance, combined with folk remedies and community support, ensured that some survived despite the odds. But death was always close. Many children experienced the loss of siblings, growing up in households marked by grief. Funerals were familiar rituals, and children walked in processions to the churchyard, where small graves dotted the ground. The community grieved together, but life pressed on, and surviving children quickly learned that sorrow was woven into the fabric of existence. In their short and fragile lives, medieval children came to understand health not as a guarantee, but as a blessing. Each day of vitality was treasured, each recovery celebrated. Illness taught them humility and dependence on family, on community, on faith. Remedies, whether herbal or spiritual, reflected the determination of parents to protect their children with whatever means they had. Though fragile, children found joy even in sickness. A mother's soothing touch, a whispered prayer, or a sweet draught of honeyed water could bring comfort. In their resilience, laughter, and endurance, they embodied the hope of the village that despite illness and death, life would continue, carried forward in the strength of those who survived. In the medieval village, a child's upbringing was guided not only by love and necessity, but also by discipline. Rules shaped daily life, instilling obedience, respect, and responsibility. Childhood was not seen as a time for unchecked freedom. Rather, it was a training ground for adulthood, and discipline was the means by which parents, elders, and the wider community prepared children for their future roles. A family was the first authority. Fathers were the heads of households, and their word carried weight. Mothers, too, exercised authority, particularly within the home. Children were expected to obey without question. Disobedience was not merely seen as personal defiance, but as a disruption of the order that held the household and the village together. A child who failed to listen risked not only punishment at home, but also the disapproval of neighbors. Discipline often took the form of corporal punishment. A swat on the hand, a cuff on the ear, or a switch across the legs were common methods of correction. Parents believed that sparing the rod spoiled the child, and physical discipline was viewed as a natural and necessary part of teaching. It was not intended to brutalize, but to instill respect and remind children of boundaries. Alongside these measures, stern words and scolding served to reinforce lessons of obedience. Yet discipline was not only about punishment, it was about order. Children were taught to respect elders, speak only when spoken to, and carry out tasks diligently. They learned to bow their heads in church, to wait their turn at meals, and to treat tools, animals, and food with care. Rules governed everything from mealtime matters to how one greeted a neighbor in the lane. A child's behavior reflected on the entire family, so parents worked diligently to ensure their children upheld the reputation of the household. The church reinforced discipline with spiritual authority. Priests preached about sin, obedience, and humility, reminding children that their actions were watched not only by parents, but also by God. Confession offered children the chance to repent for misbehavior, whether lying, stealing, or showing disrespect. Fear of hellfire and divine judgment underscored lessons of obedience, giving discipline an eternal dimension. Schools, for those who attended, were places of particularly strict discipline. Priests or clerks who taught reading and prayers often kept a rod or strap close at hand. Mistakes in recitation, sloppy handwriting, or inattentiveness could result in immediate punishment. Education was seen not just as a transfer of knowledge, but as training in obedience and orderliness. For many children, the memory of school was as much about discipline as learning. Beyond the home and church, the community also took part in enforcing rules. Neighbors did not hesitate to scold children caught misbehaving in the lanes or fields. A boy who trampled crops or a girl who shirked her duties might be chastised by someone other than their parents. In this way, discipline was communal. The village collectively shaped the behavior of its young. Work itself was a form of discipline. Chores required attention, patience, and endurance. Children learned that laziness brought rebuke, while diligence brought praise. The rhythm of tasks fetching water, tending animals, gathering firewood instilled a sense of responsibility and structure. Work was both survival and moral training, teaching children that their efforts had real consequences for their family's well-being. Rules also extended to play. Children were expected not to disturb adults at work, not to damage property, and not to play during times of worship or solemnity. Play was permitted, even encouraged, but always within boundaries. Parents allowed laughter, running, and games, but they also expected children to return quickly to tasks when called. At the heart of discipline was the belief that a child must grow into a responsible adult. Obedience was seen as the first step toward learning humility, respect, and self-control. A child who learned to obey parents and elders would, in turn, learn to respect the laws of the village, the authority of the church, and the order of society. Yet discipline was not without compassion. Parents balanced correction with care, knowing that children needed guidance as much as punishment. A father might scold a son harshly for breaking a tool, but later show him patiently how to mend it. A mother might slap a daughter's hand for spilling flour, but then comfort her with a story as they worked side by side. Discipline was firm, but it was rooted in the desire to prepare children for the harsh realities of life. For children, these rules and corrections became the invisible walls of their world. They grew up understanding what was expected, what was forbidden, and what was valued. Discipline shaped not only their behavior, but their identity, teaching them to see themselves as part of a family, a community, and a faith. In the end, discipline in a medieval village was less about punishment than preparation. It readied children for adulthood by instilling habits of obedience, respect, and responsibility. Though strict by modern standards, it was seen as an act of care, ensuring that children could survive, thrive, and uphold the fragile order of village life. As children in medieval villages grew older, the line between childhood and adulthood blurred. By the age of 10 or 12, many were already stepping into the roles that would define the rest of their lives. For some, this meant continuing the labor of their parents in the fields or household. For others, it meant leaving home to begin an apprenticeship, learning a craft or trade that might offer a more secure or respected place in society. Childhood, brief to begin with, ended swiftly in preparation for the responsibilities of adulthood. For boys, apprenticeship was often the gateway to a future beyond farming. Not every family could spare a son for trade, but those who could sometimes arranged with a local craftsman, a blacksmith, carpenter, cooper, or miller for the boy to serve as an apprentice. The arrangement varied. Sometimes a small payment was made to the master. Sometimes food and shelter were considered payment enough. In exchange, the boy lived with the craftsman's family, performed menial tasks at first, and slowly learned the secrets of the trade. The life of an apprentice was far from easy. Long hours of work were demanded, beginning with sweeping floors, fetching water, or tending fires. Gradually, the apprentice was allowed to handle tools, carve wood, shape metal, or mend broken items. Each mistake brought stern correction, but with time, skill grew. For a boy, the chance to master a craft offered pride, potential independence, and perhaps one day the status of a respected artisan. Girls, too, sometimes entered apprenticeships, though their roles were often tied to domestic service. A young girl might be sent to live with another family, where she learned cooking, spinning, weaving, or childrearing. Such arrangements prepared her not only for managing her own household one day, but also for employment as a servant in wealthier homes. Domestic apprenticeships were often demanding, requiring diligence, obedience, and humility, but they also expanded a girl's knowledge beyond her own family's skills. For many children, however, apprenticeship was not an option. Most boys inherited their father's work in the fields, learning to sow, reap, and tend livestock. Daughters followed in their mother's footsteps, perfecting the arts of baking, brewing, weaving, and nursing. Their apprenticeship was informal but relentless, carried out day after day within the home and farm. By their mid-teens, they were already contributing as fully as adults. The transition into future roles was often marked by formal agreements. An apprenticeship contract might be drawn up, witnessed by neighbors or the parish priest. It laid out the obligations of both master and apprentice. The boy must obey, work diligently, and remain for a set number of years. The master must provide training, food, shelter, and sometimes a small wage at the end. Breaking such agreements could bring shame or conflict, so families entered them carefully. For some children, particularly boys with ambition or families with connections, apprenticeships opened the door to life beyond the village. A skilled craftsman might find work in a nearby town, join a guild, and secure a more prosperous future than farming could offer. These opportunities were rare but possible, and they fueled dreams among village children of a different life. The church also provided future roles for a few. Some boys became clerks, monks, or priests, learning Latin, scripture, and writing. Families sometimes dedicated a child to the church, seeing it as both a spiritual offering and a chance for security. For girls, entering a convent was another path, though less common among peasants. Such roles required education and discipline, but they offered escape from the uncertainties of farming life. Marriage was the expected role for most. By their mid-teens, girls were often betrothed, sometimes younger, depending on family needs and local customs. Boys, too, were expected to prepare for marriage by acquiring land, skills, or steady work. From childhood onward, every lesson in work, discipline, and faith prepared them for the day they would manage their own household, Responsibility came early. By 12 or 14, a boy might be considered capable of adult labor, a girl of managing domestic duties. The modern idea of adolescence as a long period of transition did not exist. Instead, children moved swiftly into the adult world, their roles defined by necessity and expectation. Yet despite the weight of these roles, there was pride in the transition. A boy apprenticed to a blacksmith wore his role with dignity, proud to carry tools or stoke the forge. A girl entrusted with her first loom or cooking pot felt the honor of responsibility. Families celebrated these milestones quietly, knowing that each child stepping into their role secured the survival of the household. The future was never certain, but apprenticeship and early labor gave children a path forward. Whether in the field, the workshop, the church, or the home, their roles connected them to the long chain of generations before and after. The lessons of childhood obedience, skill, and endurance blossomed into the responsibilities of adulthood, ensuring that the rhythm of village life continued unbroken. Life for a medieval child was never without danger. Though moments of joy, play, and companionship filled their days, hardship was always near at hand. Childhood was fragile, shadowed by hunger, illness, accidents, and the unpredictable blows of fate. To grow up in a village meant learning early how precarious survival could be, and how resilience was the only answer to the constant presence of risk. Hunger and famine were among the greatest threats. In years of poor harvests, food supplies dwindled, and children were often the first to suffer. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making them more vulnerable to sickness. Families sometimes stretched meals by thinning pottage with water or mixing ground acorns into flour. Children learned to live with gnawing hunger, their bellies never truly full. In the harshest years, famine swept entire villages, leaving behind silent cottages and empty fields. Disease and illness struck with merciless force. Even a small infection could prove fatal. Epidemics such as dysentery or influenza swept through crowded cottages, claiming children quickly. Plagues, when they reached villages, caused devastation, though even ordinary childhood ailments like measles or fevers could kill. Parents did what they could with herbs, prayers, and charms, but the limits of medieval medicine left many children vulnerable. The fear of sudden illness was constant, and children grew up hearing the tolling of church bells for those lost too soon. Accidents in daily life posed another danger. Children worked from an early age, and with work came risks. A boy herding animals might be kicked by a cow or gored by a pig. A girl stirring a pot over an open hearth might suffer burns. Sharp tools, heavy carts, and unstable ladders all carried hazards. Streams and ponds tempted children to play, but drowning was a common tragedy. In a world without safety measures, even small mistakes could bring disaster. Harsh weather added to the struggle. Winters were bitter, cottages drafty, and clothing thin. Children huddled by the hearth, but frostbite and illness claimed many. Summers brought scorching heat, with hours of work under the blazing sun. Storms flooded fields and cottages, lightning set roofs ablaze, and winds tore at thatch. Children learned to endure discomfort as part of life, finding resilience in the face of nature's power. Conflict and violence were also part of village reality. Raids, feuds, or passing armies brought destruction. Children sometimes witnessed violence firsthand, a neighbor's quarrel turning bloody, a stranger's theft punished harshly, or the terrifying approach of soldiers demanding food and shelter. Wars between lords spilled into villages, leaving children to watch their fathers called to fight or their homes burned in retribution. For the young, such moments left deep scars of fear and insecurity. Discipline and punishment could be harsh as well. Children lived under strict rules, and failure to obey brought swift correction. At home, this meant scoldings, cuffs, or beatings. In the wider community, misbehavior could lead to public shame, being scolded before neighbors. Or in more serious cases, punishments carried out by village authorities. For children, discipline was part of the hardships of life, teaching obedience but also instilling fear. Social vulnerability was another hardship, especially for orphans. A child who lost both parents faced a perilous future. Sometimes relatives took them in, but others were left to fend for themselves, relying on charity from neighbors or the church. For these children, survival depended on luck, kindness, or the ability to work from an even earlier age. Orphans often became servants or apprentices, their lives shaped more by necessity than choice. Despite these dangers, medieval children developed resilience. Hardship was not an interruption, but a constant, and they grew up learning to face it with courage. They knew loss intimately, the death of siblings, the failure of crops, the absence of fathers gone to war. They learned to accept suffering as part of the rhythm of life, finding comfort in family bonds, friendship, and faith. Even in hardship, children found ways to endure. Laughter echoed across village greens, even when bellies were empty. Stories told by the fire brought comfort when illness spread. Songs lifted spirits during hard labor. The resilience of childhood allowed them to carry joy even through adversity. The dangers and hardships of medieval life shaped children into adults long before their time. They grew up knowing that life was fragile, that survival required strength, and that community and faith were anchors in a storm of uncertainty. For them, hardship was both a burden and a teacher, instilling lessons of endurance, humility, and the fleeting value of every moment. Amidst the labor, hardship, and discipline of medieval childhood, there was one place where children's minds could wander freely, the world of stories. Storytelling was more than entertainment. It was education, moral guidance, cultural memory, and the spark of imagination. In cottages lit by the glow of a hearth, or in fields where children herded animals, tales flowed from mouths to eager ears, weaving together fact, faith, and fantasy. The first stories children heard often came from their mothers or grandmothers. Lullabies sung in hushed tones soothed infants, carrying fragments of legends or prayers. As children grew, they listened to tales told while spinning wool, stirring pottage, or tending fires. These stories were not written in books, but carried in memory, passed down from generation to generation, changing slightly with each retelling. Folktales formed a large part of this oral tradition. Children heard of trickster animals, clever peasants, enchanted forests, and magical transformations. These tales gave shape to the mysteries of the natural world, offering explanations for why the fox was sly, why owls called at night, or why the river sometimes flooded. The stories entertained, but they also taught caution, warning children not to wander into forests alone, not to trust strangers, and not to disobey their elders. Legends of saints and holy figures were equally important. Priests and parents alike told stories of St. George slaying the dragon, of the Virgin Mary's miracles, or of local saints who healed the sick and protected the village. These tales offered moral lessons of bravery, faith, and charity. For children, they were models of behavior, showing that even the humblest person could achieve greatness through devotion to God. Around the hearth in the evening, storytelling became a communal event. Children sat wide-eyed as grandparents recounted memories of past famines, battles, or great storms. These were not only entertainment, but living history, anchoring children to the struggles and triumphs of their ancestors. Through these narratives, they learned who they were, where they came from, and how their community endured. Imagination thrived in these stories. A child sent to herd geese in the meadow might spend hours pretending the geese were soldiers, the meadow a battlefield. A girl gathering herbs might weave flowers into garlands, imagining herself a queen. A boy listening to tales of knights might carve a wooden sword and stage mock duels with his friends. The harshness of reality softened in the glow of fantasy, giving children space to dream. Songs and riddles added to the fabric of imagination. Children sang chants while playing games, each rhyme carrying echoes of older traditions. Riddles, posed by adults or peers, tested wit and memory. A riddle solved brought pride. A riddle failed became a lesson. Such games sharpened the mind, turning learning into amusement. Festivals expanded the scope of imagination. Mummers and traveling entertainers sometimes visited villages, performing plays of saints' lives, comic tales, or moral allegories. For children, these performances were mesmerizing, a living story unfolding before their eyes. The costumes, masks, and gestures seemed magical, transporting them into a world beyond their fields and cottages. Even after the performers left, children reenacted the plays in their own games, carrying the magic into their daily lives. Not all stories were joyful. Tales of demons, witches, and spirits haunted children's imaginations. Parents sometimes used such stories to keep children obedient, warning that misbehavior might draw the attention of dark forces. Ghost stories, told in whispers by the fire, filled children with fear and fascination. Though frightening, these tales taught caution and reinforced the protective power of prayer and faith. The imagination of medieval children was not limited to the supernatural. They also dreamed of better futures, of owning land, of mastering a craft, of traveling beyond the village. Stories of distant lands, brought by travelers or returning soldiers, fed these dreams. Even if most never left their birthplace, their minds wandered along roads described in tales to castles, cities, and seas they might never see. For children, storytelling was also a way to make sense of hardship. A failed harvest could be woven into a tale of testing by God. A lost sibling might be remembered through stories of angels in heaven. Tales gave shape to grief and joy alike, helping children process the uncertainties of life. In many ways, storytelling was as vital as bread. It nourished the spirit, offered escape, and carried lessons forward. A child who grew up listening to tales became an adult who passed them on, keeping alive the collective imagination of the village. Through stories, medieval children lived not only in their present, but in a world of endless possibility. The hearth became a portal, the fields a stage, and the mind a vast landscape where anything could happen. In a life bounded by necessity, imagination provided freedom, reminding children that even in the humblest of villages, the human spirit could soar. In the medieval village, childhood was a fleeting stage. Unlike the long years of adolescence familiar today, the transition from child to adult came swiftly, often before the age of 14. By then, boys and girls were expected to shoulder the full weight of responsibility, whether in the fields, the household, or within apprenticeships and marriages. Childhood, brief and fragile, ended early, shaped less by age than by the demands of survival. The markers of this transition varied. For boys, the first signs of manhood were often tied to labor. A boy who could plow a straight furrow, handle livestock alone, or reap beside his father was no longer treated as a child. Apprenticeship, too, marked the end of boyhood, binding him by oath to a master and setting him firmly on the path toward a trade. By 12 or 13, many boys were considered capable of adult tasks, their childhood already behind them. For girls, the end of childhood often came with the first signs of womanhood. Menstruation was both a private and public milestone, signaling readiness for marriage and motherhood. A girl of 12 or 14 might already be betrothed, and by her mid-teens, she was often managing a household of her own. Even before marriage, daughters carried adult responsibilities tending fires, baking bread, weaving cloth, and caring for siblings. Childhood slipped quietly into womanhood through work and expectation. Marriage was one of the clearest thresholds. Betrothals were often arranged while children were still young, sometimes even in infancy, though actual unions usually took place in adolescence or young adulthood. For a girl, marriage meant leaving her childhood home, joining her husband's household, and often bearing children soon after. For a boy, marriage meant assuming the role of provider, cultivating fields, or pursuing a trade to sustain a family. The church, too, recognized this transition. Confirmation, often received around the age of 12, marked a child's formal entry into the adult faith. From this point, they were expected to understand their obligations as Christians, to confess sins, and to participate more fully in religious life. The ceremony was both spiritual and social, signaling to the community that the child had entered a new stage. Work defined the shift most clearly. By the end of childhood, there was little distinction between the duties of the young and those of adults. Boys labored in the fields from dawn to dusk, while girls spun, cooked, and managed households with the same endurance as their mothers. The playful games of earlier years gave way to the seriousness of survival. Childhood did not end with a sudden moment, but with the gradual weight of tasks, until one day a child realized they were no longer a child at all. Hardship often accelerated this transition. Orphans or children in poor families sometimes took on adult roles by necessity even earlier. A boy of 10 might be apprenticed far from home, or a girl of 12 might serve as a maid in another household. Loss and poverty forced children into adulthood before their bodies were fully grown, their innocence shortened by survival. Yet despite its brevity, childhood left an indelible mark. The lessons learned in those early years, obedience, cooperation, skill, faith, and resilience, were carried into adult life. The laughter of play, the bonds of friendship, and the stories told by firelight lingered in memory, shaping identity even as new burdens arose. Adults remembered their childhoods not as a separate stage, but as the foundation of who they had become. In the eyes of the village, the end of childhood was less about years than about capability. Could the boy handle a plow? Could the girl manage a loom? Could they both bear the responsibilities of faith, work, and family? If so, childhood was over and adulthood had begun. To us today, the loss of childhood at such an early age might seem tragic, but for medieval families, it was necessary. Life was harsh, survival uncertain, and every capable hand was needed. Childhood was short, but it was not without joy, love, and meaning. Its end was not a loss, but a passage, one that every child faced as part of the unbroken rhythm of village life. And so, in the medieval village, childhood closed not with celebrations or ceremonies of youth, but with the quiet assumption of duty. A girl at her spindle, a boy at the plow, these were the images of transition, as signs that another generation had stepped into its place in the long chain of survival. And so we come to the end of our journey through the life of a medieval child. From the fragile days of infancy, swaddled by the fire, through the first uncertain steps, the long hours of labor, laughter of games, and the stories whispered by the hearth we have, followed their world as it unfolded in cycles of duty, joy, hardship, and hope. Childhood in the medieval village was short and often harsh, but it was never empty. It was filled with the warmth of family, the bonds of friendship, the rhythm of the seasons, and the ever-present guidance of faith. These children grew up quickly, learning to carry the weight of survival far earlier than most of us could imagine. Yet within the simplicity of their lives, they found meaning in play, wonder in stories, and strength in the shared life of the community. To think of them now is to remember not only how different their world was, but also how familiar. The laughter of children playing with simple toys, the comfort of family gathered at meals, the pride of mastering a new skill, and the resilience in the face of hardship. These are timeless experiences, connecting us across centuries. As you drift toward rest, perhaps picture the village lanes, the sound of bells ringing. From the church tower, the warmth of a hearth, where stories linger, and the quiet presence of children who once filled those spaces with life. Their voices are long gone, yet their world still speaks to us, reminding us of the endurance of the human spirit, even in the humblest of times. Before you go, I'd like to gently remind you to subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed this journey. It helps us keep bringing you more of these calming explorations of history. And let me know in the comments what eras or topics you'd like to hear about next and when you listen in. Do you use these stories to fall asleep at night? As a calming background during the day? Your thoughts and experiences help shape the stories I create for you. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring what it was like to be a child in a medieval village. May these quiet reflections bring you rest, peace, and perhaps even dreams filled with the gentle echoes of the past. Sleep well, and until next time, good night.